Hello. In this video, let's fill this table and try to understand what happens to different parameters in different kinds of shock. So the first one is hypovolemic shock. What happens in hypovolemic shock? The blood volume decreases due to various reasons, right? So if the blood volume decreases, then the preload decreases. Obviously, end diastolic volume decreases. Then the stroke volume decreases. If stroke volume decreases, the cardiac output also decreases. And what happens to systemic vascular resistance, otherwise called as peripheral vascular resistance? So the BP is cardiac output into the systemic vascular resistance, right? If the cardiac output is decreased, then the BP has to be maintained, right? To perfuse the main organs like heart and brain, the BP has to be maintained in a baseline level. So the systemic vascular resistance has to be increased, because of which what is systemic increase in systemic vascular resistance means, of course, there occurs the peripheral vasoconstriction throughout the body. So because of which you're having cold skin in case of this hypovolemic shock, right? Next, coming to the central venous pressure. First of all, what is it? The central venous pressure is pressure in the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, and it is a direct indicator of pressure in the right atrium, and it's also an indicator of preload. Okay, it's basically the pressure exerted on the walls of this vena cava, right? Anyways, okay, what happens to the system, central venous pressure in hypovolemic shock? Since there is decreased cardiac output, there is decreased preload, uh, the CVP decreases. What happens to MVO2? Okay, we'll come to the mixed venous oxygen saturation at the end of the video. Then what happens to base deficit? We'll come to that at the end of the video as well. What happens to cardiogenic shock? In case of cardiogenic shock, the functioning of the heart is decreased, but due to various reasons again, like myocardial infarction, heart failure, cardiomyopathies, regurgitations, etc. So, if in cardiogenic shock, the basic contractility of the heart, the pump is failed. The basic defect is pump failure. So, if pump fails, then the cardiac output obviously decreases. And what happens to systemic vascular resistance? And again, systemic vascular resistance increases as a mechanism of compensation. Then what happens to central venous pressure? So let's see here. So normally the blood flows, returns to the right atrium, then to the right ventricle. Then what happens? Pump is failed. So there is no ejection, there is no contraction of the heart and ejection of this blood into the pulmonary circulation. So the blood pools up here in the right ventricle. Then the blood back up in the right atrium and ultimately into the vena cava again, and this exerts more pressure onto the walls of this vena cava. So this how it exerts pressure in the vena cava. So what happens? The central venous pressure increases. Okay, coming to the obstructive shock. The basic defect in obstructive shock is it is obstruction. It is obstruction to the filling of the heart. Again, let's see. The main reasons for obstruction is again the best classic example is cardiac tamponade and pneumothorax. So let's see what happens in cardiac tamponade and try understand. So let's say this is the pericardium, and what happens to in case of cardiac tamponade? Okay, let's take this as a classic example, the free wall rupture in case of myocardial infarction. So if free wall ruptures in case of myocardial infarction, then the blood accumulates in the pericardial space and it exerts the tamponade effect. So what is this tamponade effect? Because of the blood in the pericardium, it restricts the filling of the heart. So again, the blood pools up in the atrium from then into the vena cava. So the central venous pressure again increases in case of obstructive shock. Again, because of the obstruction, the cardiac output decreases because the stroke volume decreases. Not preload, because of the obstruction, the stroke volume is less. So the cardiac output is less. So again, the systemic vascular resistance increases. What happens in case of distributive shock? Now, in distributive shock, the examples for this include the neurogenic shock, the septic shock, and the anaphylactic shock. These are subtypes of the distributive shock. So basically, the peripheral vascular resistance decreases in case of in case of the distributive shock due to various reasons. Like in case of septic shock, it is due to the cytokines and inflammatory mediators. In case of anaphylactic shock, it is histamine related vasodilatation. In case of neurogenic shock, let's say in spinal trauma, whatever, the sympathetic tone decreases and the parasympathetic tone increases throughout the body. So the blood pools in this peripheral circulation and it does not return to the heart in case of neurogenic shock. Okay, whatever. Since the peripheral vasodilatation, because of the peripheral vasodilatation, um, the afterload decreases. So if the afterload decreases, then the cardiac output obviously increases. There is a hyperdynamic circulation in case of this distributive shock. Then what happens to central venous pressure? So as we said earlier, because of the peripheral resistance is decreased, so the blood pools up in the peripheries. So the pressure in the central veins decreases, obviously. Then, let's come to the MVO2 based deficit now. First, let's start with distributive shock itself. What happens to the mixed venous oxygen saturation in case of distributive shock? So for that, let's see this. So this is artery, this is capillaries, and this is veins. Normally, the blood flows from the arteries via the capillaries. In the capillaries, the tissue perfusion happens, and the oxygen extraction and the nutrients extractions takes place to the tissues. Right now, in case of and the remaining blood again returns to the heart. Okay, this is normally what happens. What happens in distributive shock? There is a hyperdynamic circulation, peripheral pooling of blood, and because of this hyperdynamic circulation, the blood is flowing in such a the blood is flowing so fast that the tissues cannot extract the oxygen. So the mixed venous oxygen, that is nothing but the percentage of oxygen saturation in the venous blood, increases in case of distributive shock. While in case of remaining shocks, the mixed venous oxygen saturation decreases because various reasons again. See, the shock by definition is decreased tissue perfusion, right? So even in distributive shock, there is no tissue perfusion happening, but still the MVO2 is high. But in case of remaining shocks like hypovolemic, cardiogenic, and obstructive shock, the tissue perfusion is less because you see, in case of hypovolemic shock, the blood is less. In cardiogenic shock, the cardiac output is less, and in obstructive shock, even there, the cardiac output is less. So the tissue perfusion is less. Perfect. Coming to the base deficit, the base deficit increases in all types of shock because simple. If tissue perfusion doesn't happen, then cells undergo anaerobic respiration and the lactate accumulation happens throughout the body. So the pH decreases, pH of the blood decreases, which means metabolic acidosis, which is an indicator of increased base deficit.